All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Candace Brock, and I currently serve as the AVP of Student and Community Engagement. And this is our youngest employee, not really, but our youngest colleague at Fletcher. Her name is Chloe, so she may be in here as well. But before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Davis, who is our Chief Intelligence Officer, just to give us a few pointers about Zoom, and then I'll come back and introduce our presenter, Dr. Fran Shelton.
Hey, everybody, it's good to be with you, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation. And I think everybody may be familiar with Zoom by now, since we've all lived through a global health pandemic, but just as a reminder, while the presentation is going, invite you to all mute your mics. That way there's no feedback or any sudden noises or things like that. It may be helpful to you to put your screen in speaker mode once Dr. Shelton is speaking. That way her face is, or her video feed is the most prominent one on your screen. And that way we can all concentrate on what she has to say. Also in the chat, if you have questions, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And we look forward to having those questions and having some dialogue with everybody. So we'll have time for that. And Candace and I will be monitoring the chat as well throughout the meeting. So welcome. We are delighted that you all have joined us and are giving of your time to be with us this afternoon. And we just want to say thanks for coming. And I know it'll be a great hour. Dr. Shelton, we're excited to have you with us.
Thanks.
Dr. Davis. And of course, on behalf of our president, Dr. Don Williford, he sends his warm regards, and we are just so grateful. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our Chief of Staff, Dr. Susan Douglas, who is logged in today. She is a phenomenal woman who I want you to watch your inbox, because we're going to have her as one of our lunch and lecture speakers as well. Again, thank you, Dr. Davis. I just want to go ahead and get us started, because we have a phenomenal woman who is going to be presenting today. So I just want to share a brief bio about her. So Dr. Fran Shelton is one of the co-founders of Faith Grief Ministries. She leads bereavement workshops and spiritual retreats. She is a preacher extraordinaire and a keynote speaker at conferences. For over 20 years, Dr. Shelton has served PCUSA congregations in Texas, primarily in pastoral care, and was affectionately called Funeral Fran by the love of her life and last husband, Bob. She has the courage to take deep finesse and duplicate bridge, stamina to be a member of 4 book clubs, and a spirit for life that sparks contagious laughter. And can I just share this, just as personal note? When Dr. Shelton and I had a chance to talk, I felt as though I had known her my entire life. Just an amazing woman. And so, I mean, just the work that she's doing, her expertise, her professional background truly lends to just the great work that she is doing. So Dr. Shelton, I'm going to turn it over to you. I just want to say this. There will be a link in the chat for her website. You will also see 2 other links in the chat for you to purchase her books. So I'm putting out that plug. If you would like to purchase any of her books, they will be in the chat along with her website for you to go and check out other after today's presentation. We're also streaming on Facebook. And so if you can, just take a moment and share on your Facebook page as well, because we want as many people, as Dr. Shelton said, we want as many people to be part of this conversation. And we know that you all are connected as well. So we want to push it out as far and as wide as we can. So with that being said, Dr. Shelton, I turn it over to you.
Candace, thank you. And thanks to you, Jonathan, for doing all the technology. That is not my thing. And my gratitude to Susan too for earlier in the spring connecting with me and telling me all about Fletcher Seminary and the great vision that it has for people here in the Southwest, but beyond. So I'm very eager and excited to see get to know the students there and how that's going to be. I appreciate all of you all. I realize that since this is at 12 noon, you're basically signing up for grief for lunch. And that seems a little, probably it's not, one of the most pleasant things to eat for lunch. It did remind me though, I've learned that oftentimes in the groups, you invite people to share the first experience they had with the death of a loved one and how then they responded to that. Because oftentimes our patterns are set early on and we tend to just carry out that pattern. And I remember one gentleman said, well, when he was in high school, he came down for breakfast and his parents told him that his beloved grandfather had died. He was devastated. This was a granddad who was such a soul supporter of his, had taken him fishing, was at all of his school events. And he said, in that moment, we chewed that grief up for breakfast. We swallowed it and we never mentioned it again. So, maybe later in this day, it would be a good journal practice for you all to just reflect back what was the very first experience that you had with the death of a loved one. For me, it was Mrs. Mom, who was from Sweden, and she'd wound up in a little bitty town in West Texas. She lived across the street from me. She had the longest hair that she braided, and she collected rainwater, which took a good bit of time to collect in West Texas. And she would wash her hair with that rainwater. And as a child, I would get to watch her as she was keeping me braid her hair. And I was fascinated. And that fascination was also because I was so endeared to her. I was devastated. I was in the 3rd grade when she died. And I remembered we did talk about it. I went to her service at the Lutheran church and I stayed in touch with her daughter. My mom and I would always go and visit. So I'm grateful that my mom set that pattern for what I believe is a little bit healthier response to the death of a loved one rather than chewing it up and swallowing it and never speaking about it again. Want to step back a little bit to tell each of you how I became involved in grief work. In 2002, I was called to a congregation here in Dallas, Texas, began on September 1st. And I was informed on that Monday morning that I would be facilitating a grief workshop the following Tuesday evening. And literally, the thought that came in my head was, is it I before E? Is that how you spell grief? I'm not a great speller. I didn't really know all that much about grief, but I was flung into it. And in that being flung into it, I discovered that I was in the presence of courageous people who had taken the time to sign up for a grief workshop so that they could explore the dynamics and dimensions of grief, understand it a bit more, what was going on in their life. I also found that I was in the company of the most authentic people, because in the depth of raw grief, you're real. There are no pretenses. What you are operating out of is just this love that has sent you into a spiral, and you are trying to figure out, how am I going to manage this now? So I had these individuals, men and women, who had experienced the death of a spouse, a child, sibling, which is, there's not a lot of grief work about the death of a sibling, but it really changes your life, because for many of us, I've known my sister all my life, and I don't look forward to that day. But variety of griefs. And so we would always start by sharing our name, and then we would share the name of our loved one. What was the nature or cause of their death, and how long it had been. what I discovered is that the emotion that rises to the surface when we share the name of our loved one. Names are powerful. It can be a formal name, it can be a nickname. There's all kinds of renditions of our names, and each and every one of them is important because it puts us in a time and a place with that individual. So a lot of times in that grief work, it called for the participants, and for me as a facilitator, a great deal of patience and space, recognizing that that space was sacred because people were yearning to figure out what was going to go on. So I was working with these individuals, and I realized a couple of years later on a walk with my husband that I wanted to re-engage. I had entered the Doctor of Ministry program, and then I'd withdrawn because my schedule was such that I was not able to complete the required courses. But at that point in time on that walk, I shared with Bob that since I was called to encounter men and women who were in the raw throes, lingering, ever transforming grief, I wanted to know more about what would bring them comfort. And so I re-engaged in the Doctor of Ministry program, and in that program, learned lots of things that have been formative, but I want to share with you a couple of the things. I first encountered Thomas Attig, Attig. And for those of you who do grief work, I believe he would be an amazing resource for you. His primary philosophy is that in grief work, there is power in telling our story. And I learned later, so when you're sitting with people in the process of grief, for your questions to be questions that prompt them to tell about their loved one. They don't need to be questions so much out of curiosity, but questions out of compassion. Ask them to tell you about their attributes that you are mindful of and you respect, wish that you could have like yours. But what you notice when you sit with people in grief is the length of the story changes. So after my husband died 5 years ago with Alzheimer's, I would begin to tell people the story, and it went past the screen. And now, as I've processed that story and had amazing people, professional counselors, and I have a spiritual director and outstanding friends who understand how important it is to listen to one story rather than commenting by saying, you're not over that yet, but they're willing to listen to it. But the story goes from way long, and as you begin to process and reconcile parts of that story in your life, the story can become a little bit shorter. So as I shared with you, my husband, Bob, had Alzheimer's, and he died 5 years ago. Still processing that. It will be one that I do my life long. I'm a firm believer that, as Queen Elizabeth said, that grief is the price that we pay for love. So we would not be grieving at all were we not loving or longing to love at a deeper and healthier way. So Thomas Attig is a great resource for any of you with that. And also what he emphasizes and what was helpful for me is that the process of grief calls for us to relearn our world. We relearn how we're going to get through the daily minuscule minutia How do you relearn walking into the kitchen that's now empty and you've got to flip on the light and you've got to start the coffee and you pull out a coffee cup that was perhaps your parents or your spouses or your siblings or your child's favorite cup and you're holding it now? What do these small moments do to your heart? How are you going to relearn that? And Addict has some very helpful ways, some small steps to take in relearning your world. So those are the two biggest takeaways that I have from Addict, and I go back and read him again and again as a refresher. I also became acquainted at a deeper level. I'd, of course, been introduced to him in homiletics when I was in seminary, but Jürgen Moltmann wrote a book called The End is the Beginning. And it's a very small book, which is delightful because it's difficult for theologians to write small books. They tend to get pretty wordy and dense. But Moltmann's is a personal story. It begins by telling about him being in World War II as a German in the Jewish tradition, and he received a New Testament and how that got him through his time of service, and he came out of World War II a changed individual. But it's helpful, perhaps not for the person who's grieving at that moment in their grief, but I find it helpful for those of us who are sitting with those individuals in their grief, to have the theology that this is an end, and yet the way God creates is that in every end there is a beginning. So what Moltmann does is he traces all through scripture, like with Noah and the flood, it was the end as people had known it, and yet it was an entirely new beginning. So it's not something that you would share with people in the grief, but it's something that you can stand on and you can hold as truth as you listen to that grief. And I have found that helpful. So what I'm doing during this lunch is I'm wanting to just sort of throw out some things that have been most helpful for me in walking and sitting with people, also in dealing with my own personal grief. So I went to a conference for continuing education and paid $175. And the speaker started off by saying, people grieve the way they live. People grieve the way they live. And we all sat there in that auditorium with our pencils and we wrote it on our paper, but we sort of started looking around at each other thinking, what in the heck does that mean? I mean, people grieve the way they live. And then she began to explain that just as I mentioned before about our patterns start early on, then we tend to take on those patterns as we either avoid grief or we come out on the other side of grief, or we put grief on hold, given your background and the way in which you operate. I also began to see that at that time, I had a woman in my grief class, so paralegal, and her husband had had a heart attack, massive fatal heart attack on a busy highway here in Dallas, and died. And they had two children, an 11-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. So this woman began plowing through her grief the way she lived. As a paralegal, she, honest to God, read every book that she could find about grief because she wanted knowledge. She wanted to know what she needed to do as a mom. She wanted to know how it was going to affect her children. She wanted to know what the next few years were going to be, and then even the impact of their dad dying. She read every book because that's who she is. She loves to learn. My husband, I realized that when his first wife died in 1980 from a second round of breast cancer, Bob was a workaholic all of his life. Healthy or not, work was a joy to him, and it gave him meaning. So just kind of put it in your equation in your mind. What did Bob do when Barbara died? Candace is right. He worked. He went early. He stayed late. During the World Series, he carried his portable TV to the office so that he could just sit in that office and watch the ball games, because he did not want to go home to an empty house. So he worked. 7 years later, he had a heart attack, and which got his attention, and realized that he needed to do some healthier ways to manage through the grief, to acknowledge it, to acknowledge the reality of it, that his life forever would be changed. Yet his love for Barbara, and I believe Barbara's love for him, would be eternal. So how do you put those together? So when I shared this one time, somebody wanted to know, one of the things that had been helpful for me, that when I'm with individuals, I shared that I had 2 adult children come into my office after their dad had died, and they were sick with worry about how their mom was handling the death of their dad. And I said, what's your mom doing? What's stirring this worry and anxiety within your hearts? And they said, oh my God, I mean, every day she's going to North Park Mall, and she's going into Neiman Marcus, and she's buying a ton of clothes, and it's what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I said, well, tell me what your mom did before your daddy died. She went to the mall, and I mean, she was one of the best dressed women I know. That because it's you see, it's what we know to do. It's how we've coped all of our lives, and that's not going to change. Our coping skills are pretty much not going to change until we become more self-aware of them, and we decide these are good coping habits, but I also am given the capacity to create other coping skills that may be healthier for me and my family and my acquaintances. So somebody asked my younger daughters, they said, well, so if that's true, that we grieve the way we live, what's your mom do? With all the grief that she carries, not only her personal grief, but her congregational grief. And as it turned out, a number of people who attended my workshops, a large community of grief. And I was curious, like, it was always a mystery to me, is how did I handle that? And how do I to this day? And my younger daughter, as our children are precocious and know as well, she said, oh, my mom laughs a lot, she cries a lot, and she goes to bed early. And I realized that in listening to people's stories, I could hear the delight and the humor and the unbelievable magic about their lives. And so oftentimes in our grief classes, there was laughter. And people didn't understand that, but it was people who hadn't grieved. That the laughter doesn't go away. And of course, the cousin of laughter are tears. The tears are a release of tension. The tears show us just how incredibly fragile and beautiful life is. And our tears show us profound gratitude for my personal belief in resurrection, and that these individuals who we've loved are now in a realm of greater service for all eternity. Their gifts are still being utilized. Their wisdom is still being shared, and things like that. But it's on a spiritual level. And so to kind of understand that, and I do go to bed early. I mean, always have. So that's kind of how I do. But, alongside that, my grandmother used to say that grief doesn't make us. A lot of people have the philosophy is that difficult parts in our life kind of make us, they pull us up by our bootstraps and they make us stronger and things like that. And my grandmother disagreed with that. She said, our grief doesn't make us, our griefs uncover us. And so in grief, you realize you're bare. You are laid bare. You are uncovered. And one woman came to me with tears and said, I didn't believe I was so dependent on Ed. I just had no idea that this would be so difficult for me to handle his death and our daily life and our company that we ran together. I didn't know really who I was. So not only are we grieving our loved one who's died, we're learning more about ourselves. Maybe shadow sides of ourselves that we didn't know before, and we're bringing those sides into the light, because the light does shine in the darkness. And it's important for us. I also, from the Reformed tradition, one of the lines that we use is from John Calvin, that understanding of self is understanding of God, and understanding of God is understanding of self. So the process of grief, whether I believe one wants to call it this or not, is quite a spiritual process. It's been credited to lots of people, but the one I'm most familiar with, of course, is C.S. Lewis, is that we are not human beings with a spiritual nature. We are spiritual beings with a human nature. So in this time of grief, we are uncovered and we recognize parts of us. Now, I want to take comfort from St. Paul that says, when you are weak, then Christ's strength can come through. So in the discovery of, the ways in which I've handled the death of my grandparents and my parents and my husband and beloved parishioners, is I always kind of fall back in prayer, as Lynn just said, right now I am so weak. I feel so incredibly helpless, and you best show up, God. Because I feel like I think I've opened a way, maybe I've gotten out of the way so that the divine can come through. And that can be a subtle gift of grief, should we be at a point where we can acknowledge that. So those are some of the things, but also I want to share with you is that the wide range of emotions. I mean, we say that grief is all consuming. There is not an aspect of your life that is not touched, changed by grief. So that would be physically. Lots of people after the death of a loved one, they are surprised that they get bronchitis. And we've learned now that grief tends to lodge itself in your lungs. So you become physically ill. Parishioner right now, her husband's memorial service was on the 14th, and she's been sick. And you don't go, oh yeah, I knew that was coming. You just know she's following that pattern. And I don't know, in a way, is if I think you're often so often exhausted if you've cared for a person a long time, or your body has consumed so much shock that it is a way in which you're going to rest. And you're not going to rest because we're part of a society that is get up and go. And so oftentimes the only way that you're going to rest is when you're sick. And I think that's kind of how we're wired. But it does affect us physically. It does affect us socially. So many parents I've talked to that when after the death of their child and they meet new people in social situations. And what do we ask people? Oh, what do you do? How many children do you have? And I had a dear friend, her 18-year-old son died in January on an evening when he was headed home after a date. And his girlfriend called and asked for one more kiss. So he did a big old U-turn and sped down the tollway and crashed and died. She said, this is what I've done. When people ask me that question, I usually tell them I have 2 children. If I feel like I'm going to cultivate a friendship with them and they really care and want to know, I say, I have 3 children and 1 has died. So, I mean, perhaps that's the first step in a social relationship or even long-standing relationships. I've been really blessed. A couple friends still invite me to come over and things like that, but other people have said that, they feel like they get fewer invitations. I always want to encourage congregations that when you have a fellowship hall with round tables, that you put 7 chairs around that table and not 8. It's a small thing, but it's an easy thing to do. So socially, physically, socially, spiritually, I've touched on that a little bit, but emotions. So an easy way for us to think is there's 4 primary emotions. So you're mad, you're sad, you're glad, or you're scared. And I always say that fear screws up the rhyme pattern. But even think today, engaging in your work, think about on reflections about a loved one has died. What feelings come up? It is difficult for us to name our feelings. And I want you all to tune your ears to listen to folks, because you can tell if people are feelers or they're thinkers, because if you ask somebody how they're doing, they won't say, well, I think I'm doing pretty well and I'm going to make it through this. I think I'm doing pretty well. You'll have other folks who say, I feel so sad today. I had a moment this morning of happiness when I saw that red bird fly by. And I'm glad that I was able to put sunflower seeds out in the bird feeder. But I'm a little afraid of what's going to happen tonight when I have this event and I'm going to be going alone. That's naming those feelings. And I have found that individuals, oftentimes it takes a lot of practice. I went to a weekend grief retreat, and the facilitator began the retreat by handing a piece of paper covered in words that had feelings on them. And she wanted us to circle the feelings that we had or the feelings that caused some kind of physical response within us. And one woman was just floored that there was a piece of paper with so many words, because nobody had really asked her how she ever felt. She said, people just assume I'm sad in my grief. She had no idea because she hadn't been nurtured in an environment, or she hadn't worked in a place where people shared their feelings. And I sense that when we can share our feelings, we're being vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, there's also that room for healing. That if I can feel this way, then I can also feel that way. A friend, a colleague in ministry who's also a professional counselor, reminded a group of us that feelings are like waves. So imagine you're in Galveston and you're walking along the beach and you see that wave kind of come and move, and then it crests and then it subsides. So when you're feeling, you've been hit with a wave of grief and you're scared, take a deep breath and realize that feeling is also going to subside. Now, it may quickly return, and you just keep breathing. But you also recognize that you're not going to have that particular feeling for the rest of your life, because life is like a kaleidoscope. It's a beautiful montage. And I believe that part of this, I feel like you all would agree with me, created in God's image. We know that God is full of all kinds of emotions. And so why would we not also be full of those emotions? And to name them, to take time and journal about them is a healthy thing to do. So I can say much, much more. I just want you to know that these are some of the I would say the big pieces of paper that have helped me in understanding about my personal grief, and also being attentive as a facilitator in workshops, as a pastor to individuals, and to know too that, yes, today I've been talking primarily about bereavement, which is grief related to the death of a loved one, but grief is complex, and it can be, as I was sharing with Jonathan, I just moved. I downsized June 1 after living 21 years in a house. Boy, going through things, a lot of grief. I came across those greeting cards from my husband, the very first one he sent me before we were married. I came across that greeting card from my mom wishing me a happy birthday, and my children, when they just printed and it was illegible, but you could know it was their name. That grief does a number on you. But it was helpful to know what it was, and it was helpful to know that those feelings were going to come and go. But I want to open up. I'm hoping that perhaps you all have some questions for clarification, or just about something totally different topic card. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelton, for
Thank-
this was awesome. So as Dr. Shelton has shared, we definitely love to take questions at this time. You can drop them in the chat. Dr. Douglas said, thank you for this courageous and authentic talk. So very helpful. So if you'd like to, we just ask you can come off mute, or if you want to use the raise your hand feature, which is at the very bottom under the reactions. As you are formulating your questions, I'd love to ask one, begin asking questions, Dr. Shelton. Have you found in your work, do you notice any differences between cultures in the way grief is handled, or do you find that they're just kind of just an overall pattern, regardless of culture, denomination, race? What has been your experience in that area?
Yeah. Candace, I would really say both. I have found there are similarities and there are differences. I am most appreciative in the Jewish tradition. When a loved one has died, people immediately go to the home where that loved one lives to be with that family, and the family will often leave their door open so that a doorbell doesn't have to jar and upset them. People silently come in, they embrace them, they share their love and their sadness with them, and then their friends sit by them and they don't say a word. And they allow the person who is grieving to initiate the conversation. I find that instructive. I also find that in the Jewish tradition, my friends in the Jewish tradition have heard less trash. I'll just call it trash. After a loved one has died than my Christian friends. Because my Christian friends have heard, oh, well, they're in a better place. And I had one mom say, not believing that. Best place my daughter could be with me is right here with me. So they don't get the trash and the platitudes. I do find, though, that oftentimes the culture is more expressive of grief. In the Hispanic tradition, I find that, and in the Black tradition, I find that. I have been exposed to the Muslim tradition as well, and I just think they all do a lot better job. I mean, I don't guess grief work can be rated, but they're more open to expressing emotions. I don't know if it's our stoic Puritan backgrounds, being white, that we're going to be tough and do it, but I appreciate. And then I step back and then I discover that perhaps initially there's a difference with cultures, but then over the long haul, it's pretty much the same. The nature and dynamics of grief, pretty much the same. So that's just my experience.
Thank you. And a follow-up question, Dr. Shelton. Do you recommend, and we've been doing our best to keep track of the resources as we're talking about cross-cultural, cross-faith grief, do you have any books just off the top, in addition to your resources that you've written, that you would recommend for someone to have in their library in addition to your books?
Sure, of course I do. I can't call, I mean, like some of those that I mentioned earlier, but also right off the top of my head, I can't name the name of the book and the authors, but there are books from different cultures, and I'd be happy to send those to you because that would be a worthy resource for people to have, for people of all cultures to read that and just gain some insights and knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Jonathan, you want to take the next question in the chat?
Sure. So Nancy has written in the chat, I am in hospice, and one of the greatest challenges I have is in working with our healthcare team to help them express and honor their grief. Do you have any ideas, tips, or strategies that you would recommend?
Nancy,
Good question.
thank you. Yeah. Thank you for doing your work in hospice. It's unrelenting. So I admire, kind of step back in awe for people who work in hospice, because as a pastor, shoot, I get to do baptisms and and weddings. I don't just have to do facing the mystery of death most of the time. So there is a couple of things. If you could, you have the courage to ask this question, so you've got a lot of initiative. So I would encourage you to take that initiative with your coworkers and say, we need time out. We need a break. Or at least I do. And I want to invite you to take this break with me. And then pose a couple of questions. What were your deepest feelings? What are you wrestling with at night when you go to bed concerning this situation, or all of them? What patterns have you seen? And get people, ask them those open-ended questions rather than one that can be answered with a yes or no. And also maybe say, I'm wanting us to take a 15-minute break or 30-minute break. I think that if the intensity in which people work, if they say they're going to take a whole day, it'd be more than they could really handle. But I think if you could do it in small doses, I think the benefit and value of that would be great. I myself, my boss at First Presbyterian Church here in Dallas, she had us, there's a new book on grief called Grief, and I'd have to get the name of the author. It's funny, I can't remember the author when I'm an author, but she likened grief to mosaics. And so we went to a mosaic. This woman taught mosaics, and we all did a mosaic, and you can kind of compare, the broken pieces, the spaces, the jagged edges, all this to aspects of grief. And I found it a very engaging time that we could spend together as colleagues. And it was less threatening to talk about our feelings when we were really talking about mosaics. But they were our feelings. And so that was a good way to do it. So I applaud you for wanting to do that and understanding you're noting the necessity for hospice workers. You're welcome.
Dr.
Sure.
Shelton, and I wrote it down over here, and it's and you mentioned a couple of examples of this, but the question is, how can we help people process their grief using their feeling center more than their thinking center?
Mm-hmm.
And I love the idea of just a big list of feelings on a piece of paper and asking people to say, which one of these do you identify with in this moment, that kind of thing. But are there other ways that seem practical to you for folks who are pastoral caregivers, whether they're chaplains or working in a congregational context? to invite people into that.
Right, to invite people into that. I found it helpful when, as the 4 primary words that I shared with you, because a lot of people, if you ask them how you're feeling, they don't have a clue. They don't even have words for it.
Mhm.
Okay. So if you're wanting them to do it, say, I've heard that feelings kind of come in 4 categories. We're either mad, sad, glad, or scared. And we really can have combinations of them. Which of those are you experiencing right now?
I love
So just put out the framework for them. Okay. So that they've got a word, and then, they can always get a thesaurus and come up with even better words. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Anyone else have a question for Dr. Shelton?
The feeling wheel. Okay. Yeah. I like that.
During clinical pastoral education, I assure you, chaplains get beaten with it because we are so bad at expressing our own grief and issues around the work. Or maybe it was just me that got beaten with it. But
No, I think it's pretty, you're opening up. I mean, you're allowing yourself to be so vulnerable. And, and I've even found with colleagues, I had somebody ask me after my husband died. They said, so since you know so much about grief, has it helped? And again, because Candace, I kind of I'm a both and person rather than either or person. I said, yeah, it has helped. I know that I'm really not going crazy. I know I'm grieving, because it feels oftentimes like you're going crazy. So that has helped. No, it hasn't helped. That I, in the slightest moments, or that I'm running too many red lights now. No, it hasn't helped. But I feel like if we, as people who've experienced grief and are willing to express our feelings, if we can continue in appropriate ways, lifting our voices to educate others in this culture about grief, I think we're doing the instrument that God wants us to be.
well, I can say that the practices that you outline in this latest book are just absolutely excellent in my limited experience as a chaplain, but are certainly things that anybody could incorporate in their work with others. It's just excellent to have all that distilled in one place.
Thank you, Susan. And I do want to let you know that if you go on my website, I am doing a spiritual practice group twice a month on Tuesday evenings from 7 to 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. And so in May, we did breath prayers. This month, we did Lectio Divina. Next month, we're going to do the Nautilus. And so we're taking time to use spiritual practices. As a spiritual director, I believe and have experienced that it's the Holy Spirit who brings us comfort and gives us strength. So if we can engage in these practices, it offers measures of healing.
Fran, just to help people, when they go to your website to get more information about that particular meeting or cohort, would they go to the spiritual direction tab?
There's an info tab. I mean, I don't do my website, but
yeah, sure.
But I get emails from people like, they clicked on info at whatever, and then I get in contact with them. They give me their email address, and I send them the Zoom link. Yeah.
That's great.
Sure. It's been, I appreciate the opportunity to engage with folks and to learn more about grief, and to, in our learning, then to raise our awareness of being with others, because we are in a time, and I guess throughout all time, but it seems like in 2020 and on, that there's more grief. And so it takes intentionality to deal with it. So thank you for this time, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, Dr. Shelton, and thank you to each and every person who has signed up. We are just so grateful, again, on behalf of Fletcher Seminary, for your presence here. This is one of many of the lecture series that we are doing, our Lunch and Learn series. And if you say, hey, I'd love to hear more from Dr. Shelton, or hey, I have some questions on other very practical topics that you may find that you're dealing with on your job, at your church, wherever you serve, please email us. We want to bring practical ministry tools to you. And as Dr. Shelton has shared with, excuse me, within the, the last couple of years, grief is overwhelming. Grief is all around us. And so who better to come to share than someone who is trained professionally, also has lived experience, but able to give us very practical tips. You'll also notice, as we prepare to close today, we have placed all of Dr. Shelton's resources in the chat. You will also receive this as a follow-up email. I'm gonna work with Dr. Davis to ensure that all of these resources are sent to you. And at the end of the day, if you say, hey, that's a bit much for me, if you Google Dr. Fran Tilton Shelton, her name is the first one that pops up, along with her website and all of the extensive work that she has done. So you are not without hope. You can definitely find our dear sister online. So again, thank you, Dr. Shelton, for your presence here today and just leaving us better as we all live to learn in with grief. All right. Well,
Take
everyone,
care.
have a great day. Later.
Thank you all, everybody. Take care. Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.